Hello, and welcome to an Infinity the Game battle report. In this game, we're playing Haq-Islam against Varuna, and the scenario is Unmasking. Two particular thanks in this episode to viewers supporting the channel. The first is to Dan A, who's requested a game, any faction but playing Hunzakuts, which we'll be doing today. And then second thanks to Kitten Marines, who's asked for a game showing how I would play Varuna. I'm going to halfway answer that. Kitten Marines, how I would play Varuna is how my opponent Ed today plays Varuna. He's the best Varuna player I know, and I think he has a better handle on the faction than I do. We're going to actually go through two of his lists, and we're going to suggest some changes to one of them that Ed and I workshopped after this game that will give you an idea of how I would play Varuna, the list that I would use, because frankly, I would just steal them from Ed. With that out of the way, let's look at the lists, Varuna first, and then get into the game. So, this is the first of two Varuna lists that we'll be looking at, and this was the list that Ed played today. This is a cutter lieutenant list that is built around a cutter, but then attempting to support it, including with tools to push forward into hostile environments, and just generally get to the 15 trooper limit, while making maximal use of Varuna's key strengths. And really, when I say Varuna's key strengths, I basically mean helots plus generally Pan-Oceania good stuff. Varuna is broadly good at winning face-to-face rolls. The cutter is one of the best pieces in the game for that. Fusiliers are a very serviceable link option. They're ballistic skill 12, and when you want an ARO piece and some backup guns, you really can't go wrong with them for the cost. And then we have helots. Helots are one of those pieces that is determinative in basically any faction that has access to them, whether that's Spiral Core, Vanilla Pan-Oceania, or Varuna. You want, usually, if you can take two, you want two, only occasionally three, and obviously Vanilla Pan-Oceania can only have the one. Regardless, helots are a piece that represent at a low cost such a high utility. There are very few things in the game that combine the capacity of a camouflage model to stall out an attack by wasting orders, forcing the discovers, etc., with the capacity to just hard stall, like impose a critical failure state on your opponent, thanks to neurosynetics, decent burst, and weapons that can theoretically at least kill anything. The light rocket launcher in particular is nominally a threat to any piece. It has at least some chance of killing anything in the game in one go, thanks to a combination of okay damage, but it's a template weapon, so it ignores cover, and it has continuous damage. The number of time Ed's helots in particular have just randomly crit me on an 11 or a 5 beggars belief. And the thing is that's not even particularly weird. If you have enough helot shots going out in ARO, and over the course of a game or an event you will, they're the kind of piece that can just swing a face-to-face roll and win you a game. At very low investment, they can have very high payoff. And so using helots is a core skill of Varuna, and Ed is much better at it than I am. In terms of the rest of the list, obviously we have the cutter, and I'll just talk about, I like this second combat group in particular. It's 6 troops, but it's making very good use of the space. So we have the cutter, 2 helots, 2 Fugazi, and a Tech B. That's only 3 regular orders, but the cutter has both a lieutenant order and tactical awareness, meaning that in an absolute pinch, it can feasibly spend 8 orders in a turn, which really should be more than enough for what it's doing, including leaving some orders at the end of the turn to fall back, recamouflage, etc. And then if the cutter doesn't have anything to do, you still have an effective use of this combat group, just funneling those orders first into the helots, moving forward, occupying space, preparing better ARO positions if that's useful. And then the Tech B. The Tech B, I think, is very important in this combat group because if you have nothing else to do with the group, she can run forward and push buttons, and in almost every scenario, that is at least somewhat useful. Failing that, she can move, she can discover, she can do useful irregular things. This is a very good combat group, and if you don't steal anything else from this, stealing this as the basis for a cutter list and then filling out the rest of the list to taste, I think works very well. Now, the rest of the list, the combat group of 9, you would call it the primary combat group, but obviously the cutter is pretty primary. This combat group is built around doing some of the missions that are going to be played at CanCon in January 2024. We've got a Fusilier core link of 5 Fusiliers. There's a missile launcher and a heavy machine gun and a paramedic. Then the lieutenant, sorry, not the lieutenant and the decoy, what looks like a lieutenant and a decoy. In fact, it's just 2 generic Fusiliers because the cutter is the LT. But until the cutter is deployed, almost always your reserve. That's not obvious. And this is just a useful generic link that can do a mix of active and reactive duty. The Fusilier missile launcher, because it can do explosive, armor piercing, etc. damage, it imposes a potential critical failure state on your opponent. You have to treat it seriously. And the HMG is not a survivable, but a very cheap burst 5 ballistic score 15 gun. Now, the HMG is actually going to change when we talk about changes that we would make to this list, but we're going to talk about that at the end of the game. Otherwise, we've got a Knight of Montesa, excellent, very reasonably costed, fast specialist, 2 Zulu Cobras, 1 KHD, 1 forward observer. I asked Ed about this. This is another thing that will change. I think there is a strong argument for 2 KHDs, but he needed to save points somewhere, and the forward observer is still a ballistic skill 13, mimetism, camouflage, breaker combi, and it can move through repeater areas without having to try and rely on stealth and a marker state. But had you an extra 2 points, and we have a way of getting an extra 2 points in this list as we look at how we'll change this, making this a second KHD, particularly in Unmasking, which we're playing today, would really help. Then we have a Machinist and a Palbot. You are playing a Cutter and some Fugazi. Particularly a Cutter Lieutenant, you must make the investment in order to keep it as full health as possible or recover it if it goes down. It is your biggest gun by a long margin. Just take the Machinist, it's worth having. So this is a broadly well-rounded, well-built Varuna list that I would recommend to anyone. We'll make some small adaptations to it at the end of the video, but it's got 3 independent pieces that can all spend orders very efficiently, a core that can feasibly spend orders relatively efficiently, and then this wonderfully built first combat group around the Cutter Lieutenant, but with support elements that work quite well. So this is an example of how I would recommend Varuna be played, and in this particular case, it's built to be kind of flexible in the CanCon mission lineup. Let's just look at a second list for comparison. Now, this is an example of a more specialized Varuna list. In particular, this is a Varuna list built to play countermeasures and the armory. And there are some specific adaptations that are going on here to account for that. So obviously, among other things, you'll see there's no tag in this list, despite the fact that it's Pan-Oceania. Pan-Oceania runs tags very well. Tags are a weight on a list, and in this case they've been removed because this list is trying to do a couple of scenarios. Countermeasures, it's obvious how the list is adapted to countermeasures. This list can do, I believe, every single countermeasure classified, which you don't actually need. You don't need to be able to do every classified in countermeasures. It's more forgiving than highly classified, but it certainly doesn't hurt. It's good to have that in a list if you can, and this list can do that. This list is otherwise built kind of more classically, where we have our secondary combat group here in Combat Group 1 that is looking to do some utility work with things like the Zulu Cobra, the Peacemaker, the Pathfinder. This list does afford a Peacemaker. I'm being forced by the viewers to write Pan-Oceanian lists, and I'm finding Peacemakers turn up in fewer and fewer lists now. The cost increase from 20 to 24 is a pretty big deal, but they're still a good piece if you can afford them. And in the primary combat group, we have a Kamau sitting at the head of the link this time, a Hacker because you're playing countermeasures, it's always good to have one anyway. And the main things that make this list adapted for armory, apart from the Peacemaker being able to chuck its Oxbot into the list, is we have the Kamau, Patsy, and Machinist Haris team, which Pan-Oceania and Varuna especially doesn't love making close assaults, but if you combine these 3 with a Zulu Cobra and a Peacemaker Oxbot, you at least have some capacity to clear or hold an armory room, and this is a pretty high utility, relatively low cost link, where you've got a specialist in the form of the Machinist. I think Patsy is a specialist as well, she's an NCO. You've got short range fighting, you've got long range fighting. The Kamau HRL submachine gun is a very cheap, efficient gunfighting piece when you throw it into a link for the burst. Then we have a duo of 2 Knights of Montesa. Now, Knights of Montesa on their bikes obviously can't enter the armory, but they can dismount to enter the armory, and they are fairly, like, for their points cost, at what they do. The hacking is obviously an issue because they are heavy infantry, etc., etc. Their BTS is pretty good, but you never want to take unopposed hacking rolls. But what they can do is they can breach or hold an armory if they need to. They are non-trivial to kill. They fight well at a variety of ranges thanks to the martial arts CC combination of boarding shotgun Red Fury. This is pretty luxurious. Like, the points cost of these guys is costing you what it would otherwise, you would get a tag for those points. But in the armory, you don't want a tag, you want something that can push into and hold the armory. And to do that, you need to have something that's silhouette 2 or lower, because you can't otherwise enter the armory gates, which these guys can do. So this is an example of a more heavily specialized Varuna list that's trying to do some specific things. But if you look at what's in this, there's very little in the way of fat. In fact, there's no Fugazi even in this list. This list has virtually no cheerleaders. The closest thing it has is the Fusilier Kamau core, and even that is building to do things. So I quite like this list as well, although I wouldn't use it for general use. This is a specialized Varuna list. Now, if you wanted to hear more about Varuna and lists that Ed has played or is considered playing for CanCon, I do know that he submitted his lists to the recent Loss of Lieutenant Pimp My List podcast. I'm not 100% sure I'd recommend it though. I believe it was a pretty good podcast generally. I don't know who did Ed's lists in the Pimp My List section, but Ed showed me the before and after suggested changes, and whoever it was that was doing those changes was either trying to intentionally sabotage him or does not know Pan-Oceania very well. So obviously it's a very good podcast, Loss of Lieutenant I've got a lot of time for. Ed's lists were featured on that, but I'm not sure I'd recommend listening to it for commentary on Varuna, because frankly, whoever came up with those changes has white dog shit where their brains should be, to quote Australia's oldest and best newspaper. With that slagging out of the way, I do like Lost Lieutenant quite a lot, recommend them strongly. Let's have a look at the Haq-Islam list that I'm playing. So the challenge that I had been set was by Dan A, supporter of the channel. Thank you very much, Dan. And he just wanted a game with Hunzakuts. Hunzakuts plural, and their availability 2 is all you're going to get in any faction that they are available in. And I spent a little bit of time beating my head against this because I am not a Hunzakut fan. That is not to say that I think they are a bad unit, but I love irregular troops, and especially in ITS Season 15, there is less and less space for irregulars. The budget of irregulars that a list can manage is lower than it's ever been, and the reason for that is not that irregulars have become worse, it's that the way you can use your command tokens has become more flexible. With the O12 Prestige rule in play in ITS Season 15, you are no longer as likely to convert irregular orders to regular, and that means that irregular troops really genuinely have to justify themselves. They have to be pretty likely to spend their irregular order each turn, or you are effectively playing an order down by taking them. And the discount that a trooper gets for being irregular is not enough to justify that in most cases. And so when we think about Hunzakuts, what I have found at least in the past is that their role, they're a specialist, reasonably useful template armed midfield skirmisher, but they're a Whip 14 specialist. One of the big things about them. The 18 point, you'll see two of them in this list. The 18-point forward observer Whip 14 is a very serviceable profile, but the role that it fills a lot of the time is of a unit that just sits in the midfield until its time has come to do something. And a piece like this, if this was regular, I would often cheerfully, obviously it would be more expensive, but I would often cheerfully not spend any orders on it right up until it became really important, at which point I'd spend a lot, or it would be critical to press a button once in a game, something like that. And what that means is that being irregular is a genuine downside for a piece like a Hunzacourt, because that means that in multiple turns over the course of the game, it being an irregular troop is kind of actually a dead weight. The plan for this list, therefore, was to force the Hunzakuts into usefulness by aggressively over-infiltrating them and making use of the deployable repeaters. If they pass the roll, fantastic. They're an excellent place to do something very dangerous. If they fail the roll, well, I will be using their irregular orders to run them back into the battlefield. This is not a good use of the troop, but they would actually end up being pretty important in this game, in particular the fact that they have deployable repeaters. So we'll get to the rest of we'll get to the game and we'll see what they do shortly, but the rest of the list otherwise is just a Haq-Islam good stuff shell. By committing to the Hunzakuts, we're committing to the deployable repeater play. By committing to the deployable repeater play, we're committing to hacking and guided missiles. And that forces a lot of this list into the shape that it's in. So we have 3 hackers, 1 Bareed killer hacker, 1 Bareed hacker, and 1 Mukhtar hacker. That's to give us enough relatively resilient hacking to guarantee the guided missiles are always live. We're playing guided missiles because we're playing all of this hacking. And with those pieces chosen, we then have relatively limited slots and SWC to do much else. So if I want some gunfighting, all we've got SWC for is a Mukhtar and Nauf. We don't have SWC or points, for example, for an Azrael. But since we're taking Nauf, we're going to take a Ghulam Pocket Doctor for him. We've got a Fanoush just as 1 repeater, Saladin as a 2nd. Then it's for day, Zamira, Zolekia. That's all we have points for. It's the cheapest for day. I could downgrade either or both of these biker girls, but if you can afford them, they do materially perform better. They are worth taking generally over, say, the 7-point Comb Rider, so I will take them. And that's basically the list. It's a big Haq-Islam good stuff pile, oh, and a Lobotos, obviously, that has made space for 2 Hunzakuts and the associated guided missile playmaking that they will enable. This list is not built for unmasking, but since I'm looking to aggressively over-infiltrate the Hunzakuts anyway, the exclusion zone in unmasking doesn't let me down too much. And frankly, having guided missiles in unmasking can be very, very useful, although we'll see exactly how useful toward the end of the game. Being able to reach out and touch very, very heavily defended HVTs in this scenario can be highly useful if you can't just get into them and deal with them, which if your opponent, for example, is playing Varuna and can put up an aggressive defense, you may be unable to. So, those are the lists, including some thoughts and suggestions on how to play Varuna generally for Kitten Marines, and a double Hunzakut list for Dan A. Let's look at the table and play the game. So we make the lieutenant roll, whip 12 to whip 16, I roll a 17 and Ed rolls a 1, and he snap picks going first. I think in unmasking there is no particular reason to go second, except that there may be a reason to deploy second. Ed's position basically was he didn't want to deal with Assassin for day, he didn't want to let me go first, and that is fair enough. For my part, there is an old wisdom that going second against Varuna is a worthwhile play, and we're going to actually explore that more as the game goes on because it's very relevant here. Regardless, this is a relatively dense table. In particular, we have 3 pieces of fairly significant high ground that are blocking line of fire between the deployment zones. Here, this tower, and then this big objective. It's not actually an objective room in this scenario, but this room here. However, there are still large lines of fire, say between there and there, along this table edge here, between these sort of like basically a lot of Overwatch back and forth potential between here, this sort of part of the table and this part of the table here. For Ed's part, he is elected to go first, which means he's deploying first. I have picked this table edge because I feel it has better access to the buttons. We've got 3 buttons here. One of them is on this high ground just next to this little console thing. One of them is behind this building here. Now, both sides will have to move up and around to access this button, but I think it's easier to do so from the deployment zone that I have picked. And then the other button is not visible in this photo, but it's actually nooked in underneath this building here, but readily accessible from the ground level. That is going to be the hardest for me to access because Ed will deploy heavy ARO presence over it. So in terms of Ed deployment, he has the Fugazis both put in a picket situation. This one here is prone, the other one is standing, but they're up against the back table edge. And this is classic, like, watch everything play. By putting a 40mm base against the back table edge, it's impossible to sneak up on because a 25mm base physically can't fit all the way behind it into its back arc. And that gives this Fugazi here a comfortable line of fire down there and down there. And this Fugazi, which is literally nestled in the back table, can see all the way along there and all the way along there. So if I get particularly cheeky with Fidays or combat troops or whatever, they are in position to respond. The Fusilier link is going to be deployed on this large building here. The building, I've put these pieces all together so that you can move up and over and around them quite flexibly. I like doing that with these terrain pieces. And we've got the missile launcher here, the HMG is prone here, the paramedic is next to the missile launcher, and then there are 2 Fusiliers sort of on ground level and the stairs just watching various positions. Now, it's been kind of impossible for Ed to position these in a way where a shotgun template couldn't hit multiple pieces, but he is going first, so he has a chance to unpick that. Our first helot deploys here, and our second helot deploys here, although both of them will be intended to move over the course of the game. Otherwise, we have 1 Zulu Cobra on the stairs. This is the Killer Hacker. The Forward Observer Zulu Cobra is nooked safely back here, and the Biker deploys Impetuous just next to these stairs. If it chooses to take the Impetuous order, it will move up and over. Ed can make the decision once he's seen what I deploy. His reserve drops, he actually deploys 2 models as his reserve drops. Those will be the Machinist and the Cutter, which will come down. The Cutter will come down here in response to a Assassin for day, and the Machinist and its Palbot will just deploy here and here in relatively safe positions. Ed, I believe, is doing that because he doesn't want the Machinist to get scalpeled out. It's too important to the Cutter, particularly with my like asymmetric style of Haq-Islam play. It's not difficult for me to do 1 or even 2 orders to the Cutter. It's just difficult for me to do 3 to it in a turn. And what that means is that the Machinist not getting scalpeled out keeps the Cutter much more live and safe to engage with over the course of the game. For my part, I have 2 reserves, and they're both going to be my Hunzakuts because I want to launch them as a surprise, which means my Fiday deploys as part of the normal deployment. It's going to deploy here. It's actually back from cover slightly so that if it needs to, it can put a template down over both the missile launcher and the paramedic, or the missile launcher and the tech B, sorry, the tech B who is here. Otherwise, we are going fully to ground. My general plan here is when I look at Ed's deployment, I am relatively convinced that there is a tag coming, even though he deployed two things, which does kind of help camouflage the presence of the cutter until it deploys. There's just too much that's not present. I am pretty sure that if there's not a cutter coming, then there's something big. For that reason, we put basically nothing on ARO, but I have a hacking network of sorts. I can present that to defend, and it's pretty good at defending against Ed's kind of list. So what we're doing, oh, by the way, Ed's HVTs, two of them were deployed behind this building, and one of them was deployed, I think, nooked in here. I would not be able to kill it the whole game, so I forget where it was. For my part, I've put one HVT all the way down over here, and then two HVTs here. And I had to have a long think about which of these I wanted to be the real one. There's some argument for being the back, some argument for being the front. It's ultimately a very minor optimization either way, but I chose the front one to be the real one. And the reason for that is if I choose the back one to be real, then the front one is sort of, it's not actually obscuring it because I don't believe HVTs block line of sight, but they do block movement. There is a chance that if the back one is real, then Ed reveals the front one anyway as part of an attack run and can hit them both with a template. Whereas if the front one is real, my plan is it's more likely that the front one is revealed. If the front one is chosen, then at least the back one will be likely to stay a HVT and not give up the decoy HVT points in the event that the front one is chosen on the back one. I'm not explaining that particularly well, but there was a rationale for making the front one just in terms of casualty mitigation, on the grounds that Ed was equally likely to pick either of them as the first one that he revealed. When you're playing Unmasking and you are deploying HVTs like that, it's generally important not to go too deep into the paper, scissors, rock mental analysis where you're trying to think 2 or 3 or 4 moves ahead of your opponent. In fact, in unmasking, sometimes it can be totally worthwhile to just randomly generate a HVT that is your chosen HVT. And I sometimes wonder if unmasking wouldn't be better if it was random generated anyway. In either case, I'm going to be heavily defending this flank with this HVT being my real one. So we've got a Libertos on the stairs here with its mine. We have a Mukta MSV2 Red Fury. Zamira with her flamethrowers and breaker pistols is deployed there. I have a Fanus hanging out down here. It's prone behind this little barricade, being a repeater. We have our Bereed Hacker here. Ignore this camouflage marker, it was a failed Hunzakut deployment. We have Saladin hanging out well down here. We have the Bereed Killer Hacker here and the Mukta Hacker here. Now, the Mukta Hacker being this far forward is a little bit aggressive because Ed, I know, is very comfortable using Zulu Cobra Killer Hackers, but I've deployed it this far forward on the grounds that his two camouflage markers are both in this part of the table, and if he comes after me, firstly, this one has to be a Killer Hacker, and he has to walk back down the stairs all the way up and around, and it's a relatively long path to get there, so I am somewhat willing to take the risk. Otherwise, on this rooftop down here, we have Nauf's Pocket Doctor and then Nauf. Nauf is deployed there, he's prone, but with the missile launcher where it is, he actually has a very long line where he can move standing over to here and get line of sight from this point, which would almost certainly be a shot outside 40 inches, which would put the missile launcher in bad range, and importantly, the Doctor would not get caught in the splash if the missile fires back. So that gives me a very good face-to-face roll if the missile launcher doesn't move, but spoiler alert, the missile launcher is going to move. Ed then deploys his cutter, and he's deployed his cutter here specifically to watch the Fidei and spend a bunch of orders potentially dealing with it. And then I deploy my Hunzakuts. Now, what I'm aiming to do is land, I need a 9 to land, so 45% chance. I have 2 of them. A fairly good chance of landing at least one of them. What I'm looking to do is land one of them here, with the idea being that if the cutter reveals itself, I can pop down a deployable repeater. It will be behind this parapet. It will hopefully have the cutter inside zone of control, and that will put Ed in a proper pickle trying to deal with this Hassassin Fidei. However, both of them fail, and that's not a huge surprise to me because frickin' Hunzakuts, one of them deploys over here and the other one deploys over here. I'm not unhappy with, in particular, this deployment because what I am actually kind of concerned about is it is difficult for Ed to approach Saladin because the paths towards him are all going to be, at least somewhat through a repeater area. But if he goes after Saladin with a Zulu Cobra, it would be very order intensive, but he might actually be able to do it. And so having just a little bit of insurance down here helps ensure that that doesn't happen. Now, that said, I would much rather the Hunzakuts, at least one of them, have landed. We'd have had a very spicy game on our hands if they did, but both of them whiffed. Well, the Fade made it at least, so I can't be too unhappy about that. Ed goes first, and when I look at his combat groups, it becomes relatively apparent to me that yep, the cutter's combat group will be spending all of the orders on the cutter or maybe the tech B, and it won't be spending any orders on the tech B until the Fade is dealt with because of the location. We can see the Tech B is hanging out here and will really cop a. There's a potential risk of shotgun on her if she moves. I think she actually might be safe to move in the immediate because the Fusilier missile launcher is blocking line of sight, but nevertheless. Ed does take his impetuous order, and the bike moves up and around, and it will dodge. Basically, it'll be looking to work its way over here over the course of the turn. And then Ed sets about dealing with the Hassassin Fade. And he does this in a fairly clever way. So I have set up the Hassassin Fade in a situation where, yes, if I reveal, I can cop a shotgun down, I can potentially do some good work, but I want the Hassassin Fade really to be an order sink. I want Ed to have to go after it and dig it out, and for it to be a problem for him, because I want to blunt his offensive elsewhere. And so he just moves the Fusilier core. He makes the missile launcher the link leader and moves it out and around this way, leaves the paramedic where she is, and basically just dares me to ARO. Because if I ARO right now, it'll probably be with a template. The missile launcher will be able to respond with a burst 3 ballistic skill 15 plus range bonus pistol, and almost certainly put the Fade down. And if it doesn't put the Fade down, then the cutter will spool up and kill it quite easily. So he is tempting me to deal with this. And because I want him to waste orders, I decline. He makes the discover roll, discovers the Fade on the first attempt. Not unreasonable. He's basically rolling for a 12. And with the Fade so discovered, the cutter makes a discover roll. It's doing so from within 9 inches. I respond with smoke, and I roll. I think I fail the smoke roll, and the cutter is doing a surprise shot inside 8 inches, and it hits me, I think, 3 times, needing 12s, and puts the Fade down. So that's not necessarily ideal. The Fade has really only occupied, I think, 2 orders from the primary group, which is the one that I shipped orders from. But Ed spends sort of 1 more order to set if he needs to, the missile launcher up in a better position. Actually, a very annoying position because he's able to get the missile launcher out from under the threat of Nalf standing up. It doesn't take much movement to get the missile into a position where I can no longer see it from anywhere on this rooftop, so that's quite frustrating. The rest of the turn doesn't go too badly. Ed makes the decision, basically, the bait of this tasty Mukhtar is too much to deny, and so this camouflage marker makes its way up and around along the path that I said it would have to take if it was a Zulu Cobra KHD. Along the way, it pops this button here, reveals this HVT to be a decoy, and then scoots around. It has to come around to here to get inside zone of control of the Mukhtar, and I get very, very lucky. It zots in with the Trinity, and Panoshianian Whip kicks in, and it whiffs 2 of the 3. It rolls a 1 for its 3rd hit, and the Mukhtar actually manages to isolate it. So that's that for the Zulu Cobra. It's going to be stuck in this position, and it's not going to have a good turn next turn. But 1 button has been pressed, and really I'm very lucky not to have had this Mukhtar go straight down. Mukhtar is a resilient hacker. It's nowhere incapacitation, it's BTS 6, but caught without a firewall, it's really just relying on luck to survive almost any killer hacker, particularly a killer hacker with surprise. Apart from that, we just have buttons attempting to be pressed. So Ed has quite a few orders left even after that, and what he's looking really to do is to press this button. And so he makes an attempt with the biker, moves up and around to there, fails to press the button. Before he spends any more orders on the biker, which he doesn't have a great many, he activates the tech B since he has plenty of orders left in the cutter's group, since all it's done so far is to use its tactical awareness, and she hoops down, up and around. She hoops down, moves along to here, jumps up to there, attempts to press the button and fails. And I think that's basically all of the orders that she has, so she ends up hanging out there. The biker attempts to press the button, I think, twice more, and it fails twice more as well. So Panoshianian Whip is on full display here. In Unmasking, the Hacker Specialist bonus is something that you should almost always go for if you can, because it makes a huge difference to how easy it is to do this. And with like 1 Whip 12 roll, and actually I think the Montesa Biker is Whip 13, but 2 successes, basically 3 failed attempts to press this button is quite unlucky, but by no means out of the bounds of possibility. So far we only have 1 button having been pressed by Ed, and that's this one here, and I've only sustained 1 casualty, which is the Hassassin Fade, which, all things considered, that's totally okay. This is a perfectly serviceable first turn. I roll into my first turn. I have no impetuous. Both bikes are deployed being able to take cover because they're going to be primarily used in a defensive role in this game. And we just have Nauf stand up. And although he can't see the missile launcher anymore, he absolutely can see the Zulu Cobra that he's been standard here. It's in the open, and he just aces it immediately. He then moves around and also takes care of the Tech Bee, so that's 2 kills, although those are the only 2 kills I'm going to get this turn. And he uses one more order basically to hook back into cover and hide, because there's a good chance I'm going to need him. I don't have that many guns in this list. My plan otherwise for this game generally begins to take shape in this turn, and that is that I just don't want to fight helots. Frankly, I don't want to take fights against any of Ed's hard ARO pieces up and to including the cutter, unless they are tremendously favorable, like missile launcher outside 40 inches levels of favorable, because there's just too much chance for things to go wrong, and I don't necessarily have to fight them to win this scenario. On top of that, the way that Varuna plays, all of the threat that it presents in ARO that can make it so fearsome, can be basically nullified by just choosing not to engage with things like helots if you can avoid it. The trick as a Varuna player is to make it unavoidable, and often the scenario will do that for you, but in this particular case I had an out, because this scenario Unmasking is about killing HVTs, not about killing anything in your opponent's army. You do not need to kill helots, you need to fight helots unless they are in some capacity in the way of what you are trying to do. And so far, they weren't. So the rest of this turn is basically spent. The Hunzakut that had deployed down here gets yeeted into combat group 1 at the beginning of turn by Saladin, and it makes its way up and around. Now there is a flash pulse bot here that can make a discover roll against it. I am not in camouflage because I failed my infiltration roll, and I will try and shoot that, I think, 3 times with the Mukhtar coming down these stairs, but I'm not able to get it out inside 24 inches, which means that even though it's hitting on 1s or dodging on 11s and I'm hitting on 7s, I just can't kill the damn thing, and I stop throwing good main after bad, get the Mukhtar prone, and I just risk the 4 to hit, breaking cover with the Hunzakut coming over these staircases. I'm fine. I come up and around here, I press this button, lay a deployable repeater to try and get the biker who has ended up here, and this is one of the cases where a deployable repeater is a little bit worse than something like a pitcher. Because a deployable repeater has to be placed by a miniature, there's a good chance, unless you get things just right, that you give your opponent a dodge. And in this case, if I wanted to not give it a dodge, or even if I did, the Hunzakut, the restrictions around placing a deployable meant that although I was able to get the deployable repeater down, I think here, over the biker, when I then went to hack it, it actually managed to pass its BTS rolls and guts out of the deployable repeater area, which if I'd had a picture, wouldn't have necessarily been able to. Now, that is what it is. There's still a deployable repeater there. It's still good. The Hunzakuts presses a button and nestles in here, and then the Libertos comes down this direction, gets discovered by the Fanus remote along the way, but that's totally fine. Comes in around here, leaves a mine behind. So we end up building quite a fort. Not exactly a fort kick-ass, but more of a hellhole of deployable equipment and skirmishes, which I'm quite happy with. My concern is that this model here is a killer hacker. It's going to end up, it is a Zulu Cobra, it will turn up, it's going to end up being a forward observer. I would be more scared of a KHD. So we build things like, we build mines. Mines are going to be covering our repeaters. We've got multiple models with templates. And although a cutter could feasibly blow through there, the repeater, the fact that the Hunzakuts brings a deployable repeater is going to be very relevant. In terms of the HVT that I revealed one of the 2 over here, but it ends up being the decoy. I am not confident, but I'm going to attempt at least to reveal the second one at some point during the game, on the grounds that if they are both decoys, at least there's a good chance I can missile both of them in one go, because they're standing quite close together. So rolling into turn 2, we can see this sort of like hellhole that I have built. We have a mine here, a Libertos prone here, a Hunzakut here, the deployable repeater there, and all of this is fairly challenging to deal with. We can also see the biker that has gutsed out of the position that it was in, so it's no longer in under control of this repeater, but this is all still pretty challenging for Ed to deal with. One of the things that's making the game easier for him is the fact that I have, at this stage, basically no hard AROs up, because I'm not willing to contest the cutter or indeed the Fusilier guns. This makes it safe for Ed to impetuous his biker out and around this way and then just dodge backwards onto the button. But we have another song and dance of button pressing, and I think it takes Ed a couple of goes to finally press this. And when he does, so Ed has revealed this HVT back here, he then reveals the back of the two HVTs, and it's not the real one, as I discussed before. What that means is that there is only one button left that Ed can press. He controls two of them right now. He's nominally winning on scenario. It means that Ed has to press this button to reveal the last HVT. Even if he'd gotten the real one, going after these is non-trivial, but he will make an attempt on it later in the game. At this point, though, we're still in turn 2, and Ed wants to, if he can, kill the HVT. And that means unpicking this mess. So I think he does it in a fairly clever way, but it's not ever going to be particularly easy for Varuna to do this. The first thing is that the cutter has moved over to Combat Group 1, leaving Combat Group 2 quite vestigial. It's really just Helots and Fanus. And so this Fanus comes up and around using those orders, and it basically just runs at the mine to detonate the mine. It runs all the way up to there, and it dies in this point here, but doing so clears this mine. That's important because that then allows the Zulu Cobra to come up and around here and start dealing with these things. Now, it's going to end up, what will happen is that it will like split shots between a bunch of different things. It will put the deployable repeater down, but I will place another one with the Hunzakut. It will not knock the Hunzakut unconscious. And after some further back and forth, it will put this one down, but it will get knocked unconscious by the shotgun of the Libertos. And basically there's a long, like, ugly back and forth here, where the biker takes a wound, it recovers using a paramedic dart, the Zulu Cobra, who goes back down, and although Ed will eventually clear out everything around here, doing so will require him to have the Zulu Cobra will go unconscious a second time, the biker will end up back here wounded, and both the Hunzakut and the Libertos will end up unconscious, but on the last, basically the last order, going after the Hunzakuts, we actually have to check because we were both convinced that deployable repeaters were deployable 2, but I checked with the wiki confirmed that they were deployable 3, and although the Hunzakut is unconscious and the repeaters are down, if I'm able to recover the Hunzakut, I can place a third repeater. And so that is what I will end up doing in my second turn. This second turn for me is especially conservative. I am planning on doing most of my scoring on the final turn, and if I can just rebuild this hellscape here, Ed has suffered so much attrition dealing with it the first time around that if I can just reconstitute and rebuild it, all he has left to deal with it a final time is the cutter. And if he has to deal with it a final time with the cutter, his odds of also then dealing with it and pressing a button and revealing the real HVT are low. So the bulk of what happens this turn is actually just this doctor over here runs up and around here. She pauses very briefly for me to spend something like 7 orders in the first combat group spotlighting and killing the paramedic Montesa. I use this Bereaved hacker here, and it's move, hack, fail, 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 move, hack, succeed, and then a missile kills the Montesa. That's a thing that will definitely happen. When you're rolling just whip 14, even against whip 13, it's worse than a coin flip to succeed because you have both the chance that you'll be beaten in the face-to-face roll and the chance that you'll just flub the roll. You just have to force it through, and it's why I'm not too concerned about including guided missiles in Haq-Islam list all the time. Guided missiles are a very inefficient way of solving problems that you couldn't otherwise solve, and Haq-Islam is really good at solving problems in other ways, lots of the time, not always. Nothing wrong with guided missiles, but in Haq-Islam they're less necessary than they might be in other factions. You have other options, thanks to your high-quality, irregular trading troops, smoke, etc. Nevertheless, we do, after many, many orders, almost the entire first combat group's orders, put down the Montesa Knight, and then the second group is the Doctor running all the way up and around here, doctoring this Hunzakut, doctoring this Libertos, ending up standing over here, and then I use the Hunzakut 1, the last remaining order in that combat group for the Hunzakut to re-establish the deployable repeater, putting it down here. So that's pretty miserable for Ed to deal with, and if you think about how I've played this, the number of face-to-face rolls I have taken with Helots or Fusiliers or the Cutter in my active turn has been 0. Nominally, I am not winning the game, but I am in position to win it, and I'm not doing it by fighting against Ed's strengths. So rolling into the final turn, we can see the rebuilt hellscape over here, where we have the deployable repeater sort of covering most of this space, all of this zone. We have the Libertos, the Doctor, and then we've even had Zalekia drive around here and then dismount her bike and move over to here to provide more cover for the HVTs. Otherwise, nothing else has really moved. I tried to bait the cutter to reveal itself with this helper bot. He didn't go for it, but when I moved Zamira out, he did. And I wanted the cutter to be revealed just because then it would take one, if he wanted to recamouflage, it would take one more order to do it. And camouflage is one of the things I'm most concerned about with the cutter, because that's a tool that will let it get through hacking networks, etc., avoid AROs. I wanted it to be revealed, and I was perfectly willing to sacrifice an 11-point biker to get it. I even moved the other Hunzakut up and around just to watch it in camouflage state so that it couldn't recamouflage without getting away. So Ed basically does the math this game, and he confirms that, look, he's got two buttons, he's not going to press a third one. He thinks about whether or not this Fusilier team could run all the way over here, but there just aren't enough orders. This has to be done with a cutter. It's the only piece with enough orders that is mobile enough. It's in the first combat group. He brings the Fusilier into that combat group as well. He makes one quite good attempt. This Helot that's moved up here comes around after this HVT, but it's burst one inactive. It takes the shot, no surprise. The HVT dodges, and the HVT dodges. And I think actually the HVT gets hit, but survives. So the rest of this turn is the cutter turn, where it comes back and around, prompts the response from the Hunzakut, but I'm fine, whatever. I just wanted it to not be camouflaged. Moves around here, around here. It actually attempts to recamouflage here, and we rewind that order because there is a mine over here. And although I know it's a mine and Ed knows it's a mine, the game, as it were, does not know that it's a mine, and that means that the cutter can't recamouflage. It's in line of fire of a quote-unquote enemy trooper element, whatever. So it pulls back into this alleyway, recamouflages, and then it uses that camouflage to come through this space here and get around the repeater. This is really important in terms of how the cutter moves. You have to use your marker states to get around repeaters, but you can use your marker state to get around repeaters. I do, however, get a successful, I want to say, discover and a dodge, and Zulekia dodges. This is quite important. So the cutter ends up basically standing, not quite there, ends up standing here. It's out of repeater area. Zulekia dodges around to here, but what's important is that she can see this spot on the ground there, and she can see the cutter. The Doctor has been shot to death by this point, but the Hunzakut and the Libertos can both potentially see it, and it makes the run. It takes its position from here, it comes up onto this building, and then back, so that it can see basically everything, and Zulekia throws smoke, and she throws smoke there, effectively. It's sort of here, covering all three of those pieces. And that basically, she wins the face-to-face roll. The cutter attempts at very short range to deal with my HVTs. It puts everything into the one HVT that it can see, but at short range, in cover, it just makes its dodge roll. And basic smoke comes down, and the cutter is therefore trapped there. There's not much more that it can do. The Libertos, even with like 2 successful dodges, has made it into the smoke. So that's the end of the game, basically, for the cutter. It will be able to, it can pull back, it can move forward. It ends up moving to here. Doesn't go into suppressive fire. It just sort of chills. But that's all that Ed can do. And he's not going to be able to stop me from pressing at least one more button. And so, true to form, we have the hacker that was hanging out. Where's it gotten to? The hacker has actually the bereaved hacker has gotten down behind here. So he will crawl up and around, press this button here, reveal the other one of these HVTs, which proves to be the real one. And so then the Mukta hacker, which we kill, so so the Hunzakut back here, which is alive still at this point, moves up and around. Ed attempts to discover with the Libertos because he kind of has to. I put 2 shotguns into the Libertos for my trouble and kill it. And then the Hunzakut gets a deployable repeater down. And then this Mukhtar is the one that may as well do it. Move around here, spotlight, fail. Move around, spotlight, like crawling to avoid Fusiliers, spotlight, fail. Move, spotlight, fail. Spotlight, fail. Stuff it. We've got 1 order left. I come around the corner. Spotlight, succeed. Fire a missile, roll a 19. We have 1 order left, and so with the last order of the game, the Mukta basically just yeets around the corner and fires against the targeted real HVT 2 shotguns hitting on 22s, and I roll a crit and a hit, and I put the HVT down with a shotgun after trying to missile it over multiple orders. And so I don't have any decoy kills, neither does Ed. I have more buttons pressed, but importantly, I have the only real HVT killed, which puts the score at something like 8 zip, although there was every chance that I would fail to kill that HVT, and if that was the case, I would crawl over the line with a very minor win, just having pressed more buttons, which was always the backup plan if nothing else could be done. Now, we actually sat down, because this is one of Ed's potential CanCon lists, we sat down and we workshopped, could things be done differently in this game? What could Ed have done differently, or how he could change his list? And with that in mind, let's go back to the list that he played and a very small change that we would make to accommodate more of an asymmetric play environment. So this is the list, as a reminder, where we have the cutter group with the Helots and Fugazi. We're not going to touch that at all. That group is excellent. What we're going to do is we're going to make a very small change to the secondary combat group just to allow for engaging with this kind of a scenario, this kind of an environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Fusilier heavy machine gun and we're going to side grade it to a Fusilier grenade launcher. The Fusilier grenade launcher obviously means we have more dependency on the cutter as really our only gun. We can supplement that a little bit by using the points that we free up. First 2 points that we free up will be used to turn the Fusilier missile launcher into a sniper. I like the Fusilier missile launcher. The fact that it presents such an explosive ARO can be very, very relevant. But the difference, the sniper, albeit more expensive, the sniper gives us not an ideal, but an option for a secondary active turn weapon. And since we're not taking the HMG, I do think we need that, and Ed agrees. The remaining 2 points we're going to use to turn this Forward Observer Zulu into a killer hacker, the specialist bonus in unmasking, and just being a killer hacker. Killer hackers are good. There are going to be plenty of times when there's some random hacker somewhere in the field that you can sneak around and put a burst 3 Trinity with surprise into and just solve a problem that way. So having a KHD, Ed was originally the justification for the Forward Observer, apart from the fact that he only had so many points, was that the Forward Observer could move through repeater areas safely, but Zulu Cobras have a marker state and they have stealth. It's going to be fine. And so we have those 2 upgrades. We have a second KHD, much better for scenario, particularly unmasking, generally better for info war. We have a sniper fusilier over the missile, which is just definitely a side grade, but it gives us slightly more active turn potential. And then finally what we have, obviously, is the fusilier that's got the heavy machine gun turning into the grenade launcher, gives us a not ideal, but surprisingly capable option for just dealing with dug-in crap and HVTs. The Specfire rolling on Ballistic Skill 15 down to 9. Specfire on 9s, like rolling 1 dice on 9s is never ideal, but it is eminently serviceable for doing things like killing repeaters, killing, random HVTs that you can't get to any other way, bombing out objective rooms sometimes, just clearing out stuff that you don't want to send a 28, 29 point heavy infantry or skirmisher in to deal with. Killing Morans on rooftops, that kind of stuff. The grenade launcher in Pan-Oceania, not necessarily all Pan-Oceanian lists, but Varuna, who don't have the same kind of unpicking close assault elements that, say, other Pan-Oceanian things like Svalaheimer with Lang Kai and Shona Carano might have, having a frankly very cost-efficient grenade launcher in the list gives you an out. And if you never need it, well, you never need it. That's fine. It was only 14 points and 1 SWC. And the rest of the list is perfectly capable of carrying on and fighting. You have multiple breaker combis. You have, obviously, the cutter. It is very much a cutter list. You can't afford to have the cutter die. Fortunately, Ed is very good at having the cutter not die. And so that's how we have workshopped out the change to the list. That makes it not necessarily a vastly superior list, but a list that is better at dealing with unmasking as a scenario in particular, and my kind of bollocks as a player in particular. Having something to deal with those annoying, asymmetric, hunkered down Masai Morans, Libertos, Hunzakuts in this particular case with deployable repeaters can be very strong. In terms of the Hunzakuts, how did I find them? Okay, look, the deployable repeaters were super relevant. I don't like how they necessarily forced me in toward an info war, but I have to admit they did perfectly serviceably. Both of them were able to score some useful kills, deal some damage, place deployable repeaters, spend their orders. I don't think I could duplicate this list in something like Dashat Company, because Dashat Company struggles even more with managing its irregulars. It has more irregulars that it wants to take than even a vanilla Haq-Islam, and it doesn't have a lieutenant that can handle them in the way that Saladin can. In retrospect, should I have gone for the over-infiltration with them? I think yes, it was still the right decision, but only because of the scenario. Unmasking, and in fact all CanCon scenarios with their exclusion zones, require you to make certain aggressive plays if you want to not waste things like infiltration, and generally I would probably be avoiding infiltration, but the challenge was to play Hunzakuts, and play Hunzakuts I did. So channel supporters Dan A and Kitten Marines, I hope you both got something out of this game. It was very good to play. It is always a wonderful opponent. And as always, if you enjoy what I'm doing, you can support me via my Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Otherwise, as always, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.